Alrighty, in this video we're going to put together our game settings page. So what we need to do is I want to go ahead and create a pretty simple data model for containing settings for our game, and then I'm going to wrap it in a special service class that'll allow us to modify those settings and allow us to update those settings. Now currently the only setting that we're really going to be worried about are the role IDs that are allowed into the system. So we're basically going to create two layers. We'll have one layer, our persistence layer, which will have an entity that'll just basically be a key value store of strings, basically. So we're going to have a settings table, and that settings table is going to have keys and values that are strings. And then we're going to create a layer on top of that that will allow us to, in a more high-level manner, manipulate particular settings. Then we're going to put together a basic admin form that'll allow us to change those settings on the site itself. Now again, the only setting that we're worried about right now are roles that are allowed into the system. So let's go ahead and do that. The first thing we need is our entities. So I'm going to jump into the entities namespace in our Buzz MMO data project. And I'm going to create a new entity called setting. Actually, do I want to create an entity called setting? That's a very generic class name that might conflict with other things. Let's call these MMO settings. An MMO setting will have a public int ID. It'll have a public string key. Public string key will be required, and it'll also have a max length of 128 so that we can create an index on it. Next, we'll have a public string value for our values, and value will be required as well. All right, let's open up our package manager console and add a migration for add MMO settings, or settings, doesn't really matter what you call your migrations as long as it's something. And our migration came up empty. The reason our migration came up empty is that I forgot to add the DB set to our database context that points to this entity. Remember, in order for the migration framework to pick up on the fact that this is an entity class, it has to either be referenced from another entity, or it has to be added to our context class as a DB set property. So let's fix that. I'm going to delete this migration. I'm going to jump into my MMO database context class, and I'm going to add a public DB set MMO setting, and I'm going to call this property settings. Then I'm going to jump back into my package manager console and re-add the add MMO settings migration, which should now pick up on the fact that we have a MMO setting entity. Visual Studio is dying a horrible death. There we go. Okay, so in addition to the table, we also want to make a couple of modifications. First of all, value. I want to store the value as a store type of nText. An nText field is going to be a Unicode text field that is of any length. So that's exactly what we want in this particular scenario, because we don't want to constrain our value to any particular length. In addition to that, after we add the primary key, I also want to say .index. Then I want to point to my key, and I want to make sure unique is set to true, because we want to make a unique index on our key. Not only will this make it so it's impossible to add two settings with the same key, thus preventing a bunch of potential mistakes we could possibly make, but it'll also make searching on setting keys a lot easier. Now that we've done that, let's open up our package manager console and type in update database, which will run this migration against our database. Hopefully this won't fail because I used nText. And yes, thankfully that's because in MS SQL, nText is the text field for Unicode characters, but in MySQL, the type is actually just text. but fortunately that conversion was handled for us by our MySQL adapter. Let's hop over into MySQL Workbench and go to our tables and refresh them to make sure that our MMO settings table was added. Let's go to Alter Table to ensure the schema is correct, which we can see that value is indeed long text in this case. It's not nullable. Key is a varchar of 128, which is good. Oh, come on, go away. Go away. It's doing... There we go. Key is a varchar 128, which is what we want. It's also not nullable, and it's unique. So this is pretty much the exact behavior that we wanted out of our migrations. So now what we're going to do is we're going to write a service, and that service is going to be essentially a wrapper around this one table, and it'll allow us to modify our settings and retrieve our settings in a strongly typed way. So to do that, I'm going to add a new namespace in my data project called services. And the service class that I'm going to make is going to be called MMO settings service. Okay, the only bit of information or the only object that this service class is going to depend on is our database context. Because remember, our database context basically is the window into our entire database as seen by Entity Framework. So what I can do is I can generate a constructor and have the constructor take in an MMO database context. I'm going to name that parameter database, and then I'm going to initialize a private read-only field given that database. Now that we've done that, I want to go ahead and type in load all settings, and I'm going to generate a private function or a private method called load all settings, which will, not surprisingly, load all of our settings. Again, in this case, we only have one bit of settings. I'm not going to fill this in quite yet, though. That's because I want to write the public API for dealing with roles that are enabled for access to the game. So how do I want to expose that? Well, let's go ahead and do a public role, which will require that we have to do using BuzzMMO data entities. Well, it won't be a public role. It'll be a public IEnumerable of role, which of course that brings in system collections generic. And we'll call this, I have no idea what we'll call this. We'll call this something. Yes, something is a good name. No, we won't call it something. So these are going to be the roles that are allowed to authenticate with the game. So let's call this enabled game roles. And let's have a get that returns underscore roles. So I haven't created this underscore roles field quite yet, but the enabled game roles is going to be a property that gives us public accessibility to our backing collection. Our backing collection is going to be a private read-only hash set of role called roles. Actually, we could also rename this to game roles as well, because our settings service is going to have multiple little properties to manage all the little settings that it might have. I'll want to fully qualify the name of my roles collection to contain a little bit more semantic value, just a little bit more of a hint as to exactly what kind of roles these are. These are our game roles. Of course, because we created a collection as a field, we'll have to instantiate it to something. Okay, so let's go ahead and write a couple methods to help us out here for working with our game roles. We can get a list of roles, and that's good. Let's go ahead and say public bool is game enabled for role, and we'll have rolled, really, role. There we go. Which will return game roles contains role. Then we'll have a public void enable game for role, which will say game roles dot add role, And then we're going to, after we do that, we're going to save roles to database, which will be a private method that we haven't written yet. Then we'll have a public void disable game for role, which will say game roles remove role. It'll actually say if not game roles remove role, return, and then save roles to database. That's because the hash set remove method returns a boolean indicating if it actually successfully removed something. We could also do the same logic in enable games for role. We can say if not game roles add role, return. Again, the only difference, or the only thing this really accomplishes is if the roles already, if that role is already in our game roles, we'll just have an early exit and we won't have to resynchronize our settings to the database, which is a pretty sane thing to do in this case. Finally, let's go ahead and create a public void set enabled game roles of IEnumerable role roles. And this will simply say game roles equals new hash set of roles. Now, this won't work because game roles is read-only, so we can simply remove the read-only qualifier from our field. Then after we do that, we save roles to database. You might wonder, I do already have an enabled game roles property of type IEnumerable of role, and I could have easily added a set method here that would have the same behavior as set enabled game roles. But I really dislike setters from having very far-reaching side effects, particularly setters whose side effects could potentially be unperformant. See, properties should be very performant, and you should typically assume that if something is a property, it's going to be very performant. Putting complex logic in a property, for example, requiring us to write to the database when we invoke the setter of a property, just doesn't seem right to me. And as a result, I'm going to give the operation of setting enabled game roles a little bit more conceptual weight to it by making it its separate method as opposed to a setter on a property. And this will give our API a better feeling. It'll make our API feel a little bit better. It'll make the code that we use our API with a little bit more clear as far as what's going on behind the scenes. Okay, so we now have a public API for setting, for querying all of our roles, for determining if a game is enabled for a particular role, for determining if, or for allowing us to enable a game for role and disable game for role, which that role should be, there we go, as well as setting enabled game roles. The next thing I want to do is I also want to add a method that will determine if a user is enabled for a particular game. So what I want to do is I want to say public bool is game enabled for user. So what we can do is our hash set will allow us to do something. So what we'll be able to do is we can actually return an intersection between the roles a user has and the roles in our database, or the roles that we have enabled for our game, using basic hash set functionality. If there is an intersection between those two sets, that means the game is enabled for the user. If there isn't an intersection, meaning there is no role in our game roles hash set that's in the user that we passed in, that means the game is not enabled for that user. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say return game roles dot, let's see, is there, now it really doesn't, unfortunately, none of the intersection methods have a, see, that modifies it. I think the method I'm looking for is proper subset of and is proper superset of, and then, or is subset of or is superset of. So we might want to be working with these methods instead because they don't mutate the underlying hash set. Instead, we're actually just going to use the overlaps. The overlaps method will determine whether the current hash set object and a specified collection share any common elements. So we can say gameRoles.overlaps user.roles. And then what this will do is this will determine if there's an intersection between game roles and user roles. Now that we've done that, I think this is pretty good for a public API of our first bit of settings. So now we have to think about saving our roles to the database and loading the roles from the database. Let's go ahead and also stub out our private void save roles to database. And then let's think a little bit about how we want to go about storing our different settings. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another collection to my MMO settings service. The collection is going to represent all of the MMO settings rows we have in our database. And that's so that I can keep track of those entities and modify them as the need arises, and then save their changes whenever I make a modification to it. So I'm going to say private read-only dictionary of type string MMO setting entities. Now setting entities will have to be instantiated to a new dictionary of setting entities up at the top. Then what I want to do is on load all settings, I want to query for all of the MMO settings in the database and store them in the dictionary. Then I want to query if a particular setting exists for a particular thing. Like for example, we will see if we have a settings for our roles object or not. So let's write the first part of load all settings. The first part will simply say for each var setting in database.settings, and it will say setting entities add setting key, comma setting. So that's pretty straightforward right there. We just cache all of our setting entities into our setting entities dictionary. Next up, we will have to ask our setting entities settings entities dictionary if we have an entry for our roles. So instead of hard coding or not hard coding, but instead of repeating the dictionary key I want to use for our game enabled roles, I'm instead going to go up at the top here and I'm going to say private const, let's do private const string enabled game roles key equals enabled game roles. So this key will be used in our dictionary and in our database to distinguish the particular row that contains our enabled game roles. So now I can go back down to load all settings and I can finish this method off. I can say MMO setting enabled game roles setting if setting entities dot try get value enabled game roles key, comma out enabled game roles setting, then I'm going to say var role IDs equals, well actually this is where things get a little tricky. We're going to need to be able to serialize down a list of IDs into a string for our settings, because that's all we have to work with for our settings to make them generic enough to be able to handle a variety of circumstances. However, if somebody goes in and modifies a role, then we run into a problem because they might make it so that that role ID is no longer a valid number and thus would throw an exception. In theory, I could write the entire bit of code that I'm about to write in a single line, but it will lack all forms of sanity checking and validation. We want this code to be as stable as possible, and we want to make sure that if a person modifies the database directly and puts our setting into an invalid state, that we recover from that state. So to do this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say for each var role ID string in enabled game role settings dot value dot split on comma. Then I'm going to say int role ID. And I'm going to say if not int try parse role ID string out role ID, then continue. Then I'm going to say var, well, actually it would be a lot more efficient to, instead of querying for a role every single time I get a role out of my role ID string, instead it would be very inefficient to do that. So instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to say var role IDs equals new list of int. Then I'm going to say role IDs dot add role ID. After this whole method executes, now the role IDs list contains a list of all the role IDs that I would consider to be enabled for the game. So now what I can do is I can say game roles. There's a variety of ways I can do this. Let's just do it like this. Let's say for each var role in database.roles.where, now this will bring in system.link at the top of the file, where t goes into role IDs contains t.id. And then I'll say game roles.add role. So effectively what I've done is I've extracted all of the roles out of our enabled game roles setting value, and then I've gotten those roles out of the database. There's one other thing to note about this method. Typically, I like to prevent as much indentation as possible. One way we could do this is turning this into extension helper method. You can do that if you want to, guys, but I don't want to jump around in a bunch of files because people complain when I do jump around in a bunch of files that it's hard to keep track of things. So typically I would put this into another method. Probably I would put this into an extension method on string, because retrieving a list of comma-separated integers out of a string is a fairly common thing to do. Another way we can reduce indentation on this method is by inverting this if statement. Typically I would do something like this. I find this code significantly cleaner than the alternative. However, the nature of this method kind of prevents me from doing that. What do I mean by that? Well, in the future, we might add another thing like MMO setting, setting to if setting entities dot try get value and blah, 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 blah. We might also add additional blocks to this method. Because this method is conceptually, in my mind, this if statement is pretty necessary. Being not inverted, I'm going to leave it as not inverted. If you want to shut up resharper, which is something I like to do when I do something that it doesn't like, you can, of course, not do this in a prevent this in a comma or comment for whatever reason. I should probably submit a bug report to JetBrains, because for some reason we can't suppress this warning as with a comment, which is disappointing. But the point is that yes, I would typically invert this if statement, but no, I will not in this case, because the nature of the method, it feels like it shouldn't be inverted. Anyway, we can now extract our enabled game roles from the database, but what about persisting our roles to the database? Well, that's actually pretty straightforward. The first thing we're going to do is construct a string that is a comma-separated list of IDs of the roles that are enabled. So we'll say var enabled game roles string equals underscore game roles, string.join, comma, on underscore game roles select t goes into t.id. Now, oh, it does handle that, doesn't it? That's cool. Really? It does? Since when? Huh. Sorry guys, I've just been in .NET 3.5 for so long I forgot that in .NET 4 they had added an overload to string.join, which makes it so we don't have to .toString this and convert it into an array. So that's really nice. Anyway, so now we have a comma-separated list of all the game roles IDs that are enabled. Now we have two potential situations. Either A, we've previously loaded an MMO setting entity for this setting, or B, we haven't. So what I can do is I can say MMO setting enabled game roles setting, and then I can say if not setting entities try get value enabled game role key out enabled game role settings. Then we'll do enabled game role setting equals setting entities at enabled game role settings equals new MMO setting with the key equal to enabled game roles key. Sorry, I meant to do enabled game roles key on the setting entities. Then we'll do database.settings.add enabled game role setting. Finally, after this case, we'll do enabled game role settings.value equals enabled game roles string, which I'm going to move this code down to the bottom just to get it a little bit closer to its usage. Then I'm going to say database.savechanges. So yeah, this is a really common pattern that I like to do with dictionaries. So I'll pull out or I'll stub out declare a variable of the type of the value of the dictionary. I'll try to get it. If I can't, not only will I instantiate the MMO setting for the local variable, but I'll also cache it in the dictionary. The only additional step we have to take on this branch of execution is we have to make sure that we add it to the database, because presumably if it's not in that dictionary, it wasn't added to the database. And then finally, once we're done with all that, we know that this object is now valid, so all we have to do is set its value to something and then save our changes. In fact, I can just go ahead and inline this variable because it pretty much deserves to be inlined, because there's no reason to separate it out like that. Okay, I think this just about wraps up what we're doing with the MMO settings service for now. We now have code, public code, for example, is game enabled for user and blah, 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 and so on, that will allow us to effectively both query and modify what roles are enabled on our game for access to the game. And that was another poorly constructed sentence, but I hope you guys know what I mean. Starting to run out of words. All right, the last thing that we got to do is put together our settings service on our, or put together our settings page on our admin. And I think I know exactly where I'm going to put that too. You know, last video I was like, I went here. I went to the homepage of the admin and I was staring at it and I was like, oh, come on, you can do it. Oh, I got logged out. I was looking at this homepage and I was thinking, wow, this actually is kind of worthless. But I think this would be the perfect place to put our general game settings in. So what I'm going to do is basically we're just going to put together a list of checkboxes and then a button, and that button will then synchronize our settings with the database. And of course, that'll all be available to us through the MMO settings service. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to scope to the web project. I'm going to jump into my controller's home controller, jump into my view models. We do have a home index view model, that's good. And then also jump into our views for our home. So the way that this is going to work is we're going to basically be doing exactly what we did with our user's role select. So if you guys recall, there's a user role object that has a name and ID and is selected. We're going to reuse this view model in order to present a list of available roles to the admin so that they can select which ones should be enabled for the game and which ones shouldn't be. So just like on our users create, all we need to do is create a public IEnumerable of user role. So we're going to do that. Public IEnumerable of user role, and then we're going to call this enabled game roles. Get set. Okay, so before we go and fix up our index page, let's go ahead and write the code that'll populate this property on our view model. So jumping into home controller, the first thing we need to do is create or instantiate our MMO database context. Underscore database equals new MMO database context. Remember that this does come in through the buzzmmo.data project, or namespace rather. Okay, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get a list of roles. So I'm going to say var roles equals database roles to list. And of course that'll bring in system.link. Then I'm going to instantiate my settings service. So I'm going to say var settings equals new MMO settings service. And I'm going to have to pass in my database to that class. Now I have enough information to construct my view model. So I'm going to open up my object initialization syntax here, and I'm going to set enabled game roles to roles.select. T goes into new user role, TID, TName. Now isSelected is simply going to be settings.isGameEnabled for role, T. And then, of course, we want to make sure to do a .toList. Remember, the .toList will effectively flatten our query into a in-memory representation of the data. If we did not do the .toList, the query would be executed from within the view, and executing queries from within the view is bad and terrible, and you should never do that. Okay, so now that we've done that, let's hop into our index page here. And we see we have admin home welcome. Let's change this up a little bit. I'm going to say buzz MMO settings as the header. And then I'm going to say html.beginForm. Oh, whoops, what am I doing? Oh yeah, using html.beginForm. I'm going to go ahead and do div class form group. And then let's go ahead and take a look at our users create just to jog my memory on how we did that. Yeah, we did a form group, label for roles, and editor for roles. So let's do that here. HTML label for f roles, or enabled game roles. HTML editor for enabled game roles. Then we'll do a p tag, input type equals submit, value equals save settings, class equals button, button small, button default. Okay, before we load this up and take a look at what this looks like, we will, of course, this won't work quite yet, but we'll see why. I want to do two things. I want to give my enabled game roles a display name so that it doesn't appear on our label as enabled game roles with everything squished together, because that kind of looks a little ugly. So let's jump into that and give it a display name. I'm going to give it a display name of enabled game roles. Or how about game enabled for roles? The next thing I want to do is on my layout file, on my shared layout system, in my admin, I want to change the link up here, the action link, from home to settings, just to make it a little bit more consistent with what's actually going to be presented on that view. So I'm going to hit F6. Jumping back into our admin, I'll go ahead and refresh it. Now this won't look quite right just yet. I'll show you guys why in a moment, but I just want to make sure that we don't get any errors. All right, sweet. So we get Buzz MMO settings, game enabled for roles, and then look at that. It just kind of squishes all the names of our roles together. Now, if you recall, that's because we haven't provided a custom editor template for our user role yet. There's a couple ways we can go about doing this. We could create an editor templates folder inside of our home folder and basically use this exact same editor template. Or we can make this editor template global for our entire area by placing it inside the shared folder. Actually, I'm not entirely sure if it picks up on the area shared folder or not. We might have to dump this all the way down to our view shared folder. For some reason, I forgot exactly what the behavior will be. But we're here to learn, so let's go on an adventure. I'm going to dump down our editor template into our shared folder of our admin views, come back here and hit refresh and see what happens. And hey, look, it did pick up. So now we have our admin, registered, and alpha testers roles right here. And we can click on them and they check. Of course, if we click on them and hit save settings, nothing happens because we haven't actually implemented the post action for our form yet. So let's jump back into our index.cshtml. I do want to go ahead and add an html.validation summary here. But yeah, that's all I want to put in there. So now what we can do is we can go back to home controller and we can add a new action for our view, for our index view. So I'll say public AR index home index in our form. And of course, I'm going to have to annotate it with HTTP post. Otherwise, there would be a conflict and ASP.NET MVC wouldn't know which action to use. Then we'll say if not model state is valid, return view form. I did make a small typo on index right there. There we go. Now what we want to do is we want to first grab our settings. So we'll say var settings. Or how about first grab our roles? How do we want to go about doing this? Well, we have to do our roles anyway. No matter how we go about writing this method, we do need to load all of the roles in the database into the action. So we'll do that first. Now the next thing I want to do is I want to instantiate my settings. So new MMO settings service database. Then I want to say settings.set enabled game roles. And I want to set this to, this should be easy, roles.where. Roles.where. This is going to be a bit of a pain. Alright, well let's just make this as simple as possible. var enabled roles equals new hash set of role. Then we're going to say for each var form role in form.enabled game roles. Enabled roles dot add roles first or how about just single. F goes into FID equals form role.id. I will have to also say if not form role dot is selected, continue. Then at the end of this, I'll say settings dot set enabled game roles form or enabled roles, and then I'll simply say return view form. I think that's about as simple as I can get it. There is a potential for an exception to be thrown on this line. If a role wasn't found out of our roles collection, it will throw an exception because I'm using the single extension method. There's a couple ways we can go about doing that, but I kind of just wanted to throw an exception, to be honest with you. I'm totally fine with this code failing if you tried to pass in a role that didn't exist in the database. The reasoning behind that is the only way, there are only two ways that this code will fail. A, I made a mistake, and showed you a role that didn't exist in the database on the form, in which case I want it to fail so that I get a big red flag that I have a bug in my code. Or B, somebody's trying to manipulate the post request to this action and somehow messed up and malformed it. And if they malformed the request, I honestly don't care if the action blows up. Because we haven't done any changes to the state of our application before this potential exception, it'll just throw an error and nothing bad will happen. So remember, exceptions aren't really that scary. But anyway, so all we do is we grab all of our roles out of the database, we grab all of our settings, we create a hash set of all of our enabled roles, we loop through all of our form roles, making sure that they're selected. If they're not selected, we just continue. For every single selected form role, we add it to our enabled roles hash set. Then we simply do settings.setEnabledGameRoles for enabled roles, and then return view form. Let's go ahead and hit F6 and jump back into our page. And see what happens if we check admin. Save settings, admin is still checked. Click on settings, admin is still checked. Let's try alpha testers. Still checked. Let's uncheck alpha testers. Still checked. Let's go ahead and add a new role called beta testers. Jump back into settings, enable beta testers. And it's still checked. Let's go ahead and fire up our database to make sure that we haven't done anything dumb. Right click, select on MMO settings, and we do indeed have a single row with a key of enabled game roles and a value of 1 and 8. Presumably 1 and 8 correspond to admin and beta testers. So yeah, I mean, really, that about wraps up our settings, at least for now, because again, we'll need this to be able to control who can log into the game. So we needed to go ahead and write this admin really quickly before we were able to write the code on our API that the launcher will use to authenticate a user with. So I think that just about wraps this video up. We'll see you guys in the next one. Hey guys, looks like there is actually a bug in our code that we just wrote. If we uncheck everybody and hit save settings, we will see that we get a validation failed for one or more entities. That's actually not surprising, because if we jump into our data model over here on our entities MMO setting, we see that value is required. Now, it's important to understand the difference between the required attribute and the not nullable database column. A not nullable database column just means that that column can never be null. But if it's a string, it could be an empty string. An empty string is a perfectly valid string for a database. It's also a perfectly valid string for our purposes as well in a lot of cases. Now, it isn't so valid in the case of a username or an email or things like that, but it is valid for example, our value property on our MMO setting. Now, the problem is that Entity Framework is picking up on the fact that we put the required attribute, and it's making it so that empty strings are not a valid thing. They're not a valid value for this property. So what I want to do is I just want to just remove the required, just completely. And what that'll do is that'll fix our issue. That being said, if we had created the migration, the add MMO settings migration, without the required attribute on our value property, what would have happened would be we would not have the nullable false set on it. So that means that if you haven't yet created your MMO setting entity and you haven't yet created your migration, take the required attribute off the value property, but make sure that you set the nullable to false on the migration itself. So if I go ahead and hit F6, this should fix our problem. Let's come back to our admin. And it's going to say the model backing the MMO database context has changed, so the database was created. Consider using code first migrations to update the database. Fun stuff. I wonder, let's go ahead and add a migration. Add the migration. Alright, it says alter column. Now it's wanting to make this not nullable. What I want to do instead is just delete this. And then I want to say update database. Update database. Update database. That's kind of funny. I know I'm easily amused. I apologize. Come back here and hit refresh. And it worked. And if I uncheck admin, hit save, now empty values are considered to be valid. Whereas null values are still considered to be invalid, which is what we want. Now you might be like, you might be staring at me or staring at the screen and it's like, what? He added a migration, he removed all the code from the migration, then he ran the update database, and then it worked? Well, see what happens is the migrations actually contain a snapshot of your model. They contain it in, I believe, in one of these resx files, in this resx file right here. It contains a snapshot. This value right here is actually a snapshot, I think it's base 64 encoded, or it's encoded somehow, of your entire model as it appeared when the migration was ran. If Entity Framework detects a difference between the last ran migration's understanding of your data model and your data model as it currently stands, it'll throw an error like what you just saw. So what I did to fix it was add a blank migration. That blank migration caught up with my new changes to my entity model and added it to its resx file. We could have also just deleted and regenerated the add MMO settings migration. That would have also worked, but that's not always a viable solution depending on the amount of migrations that you have and other concerns, such as the existence of other developers who might also be writing migrations on the same project. So remember, adding a blank migration is actually useful sometimes, so that we catch up with Entity Framework's understanding of our data model. So if you ever see an error like that and you know everything else is correct and it's not a other kind of mistake you might have made, then your solution is to create an empty migration or regenerate the previous migration. Either way will work. But I think that just about wraps up this little errata, and we'll see you guys in the next video, but for reals this time.